Great.
You ever want to just look into it?
Love it. So, I spoke at my church in either, I grew up Catholic, either in high school or eighth grade, at a church in Illinois, and then 8 years later at a Church of Christ in Northern California. And now, a sweet friend and tireless champion of myself and all in her circle, as y'all can all attest. Recently gave a presentation on resonance, asking, is there a religion based on resonance? And we're starting with Imagine by John Lennon. I feel nice and cozy, so I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming.
Yeah. So, from telling people stories to sharing my own, that's what I'm going to talk a little bit about. Been telling people stories for about 20 years. And I'm just going to kind of give you a big picture of where we're going, and I'll get a little bit deeper into it. But, in a world where people are seeking certainty while swimming in chaos, right? Now more than ever, it's an opportunity for us to focus on capacity. Listen, there's nothing really certain out there other than change. And digging into how vulnerability and visibility mixed together has increased my confidence and capacity, creating clarity around why do I get up every morning. And with the idea that your voice and your story matters. So many people say, oh, I have nothing to share. You don't want to listen to me. Oh, I don't know. But that's really not what I'm experiencing as truth. And when we unlock those stories in a safe space, they can fuel our fire eternally and then build bridges, community. And plus you shine a little brighter and bolder and more brilliantly for others, but especially for yourself. So 3 years ago, and 3 months ago, in January, my therapist referred me to a 2-week inpatient program. She said, I think you need to go to this place in the middle of the woods, Kentucky, for 2 weeks. And I said, what? She said, I think you need to go to this place in the middle of Kentucky for 2 weeks. And I kind of cussed her out. Christine said I couldn't cuss too much today, so y'all can just imagine this. And I was pretty sure that if I didn't go, my life, family, and business might end. And that if I did go, all things, might fall apart. And so both things felt very true. So the day after New Year's, winter of 2023, I drove myself to a place called Bridge to Recovery, which is just outside of Bowling Green. My therapist suggested I check it out, and my wife was kind of given a little elbow endorsement. And this was not a retreat center. I had to pee in a cup when I got there and turn in my phone, they checked my bags for drugs and anything sharp that might cause harm to the group effort. And it was my first group therapy experience. And while I hated everything about getting there, I was cussing the authorities out, all the rules out in my head and got down, it really was a pivotal moment in my life. My drug of choice, I went in to shift. My main objective really was just to shift the narrative in my head. I was lost in self-loathing, full of despair. I had grown a 6-figure business, but I had lost myself along the way. I was being a jerk to my family. I was on the verge of losing all that mattered to me. My drug of choice was celebrated and applauded. As a friend of my team put it, workaholism, right? It's actually celebrated in society and community. I was a hard worker who valued excellence, a caretaker more than a caregiver. But that can look nice on the outside. A people pleaser, and I've been over backwards to accommodate, often to my demise and even my family's. So my dysfunction was kind of sucking the life out of all the things in my life. I hated so much so that it was bleeding onto everything else. And, they say hurting people hurt people. And as much as I didn't want to admit it or acknowledge it, I looked around at how I was impacting my kids sometimes, my wife, people on my team. I was kind of starting to see that play out. And I was 2 years after having departed the church that we were a part of at that time, right? Pre-pandemic. I was a life group leader and a men's leader, fervently zealous servant, but I was addicted to kind of projecting this image and like, oh, how can I help? How can I help? How can I help? And not being able to be present. And, so many people, I was so much in my head and realizing that there was more of me to share. So I was floundering. And I didn't ever think I'd get invited back into a church of any kind, but here we are. I was deconstructing, after what I experienced as a massive lapse in judgment from our church and from the church at broad's reaction to Black Lives Matter, everything that was happening in the world. My pastor at the time, he responded to the community in Nashville when a tornado go through, right? And I remember having a conversation with him after the pandemic, and I was like, hey, the tornado's going through everybody's house, basically, an analogy, right? And I was like, we haven't heard from you. And I'm like, what are we doing if we're not really focused on community? And he was like, yeah, I hear you, I feel ashamed. And I circled back a couple weeks later to talk about Black Lives Matter and how I feel like we're kind of missing it. And he was friends with the governor and kind of seeing it from a different perspective. And then like a couple weeks later, dropped through some verses about not questioning authority from the pulpit. And I was like, I'm out, and I can't do this. And all that to say, there was a lot of upheaval. I grew up Catholic and then transitioned to a couple of Christian denominations. And so my kind of foundation, right, was just kind of obliterated. And my full story felt so trivial and challenges, really insignificant compared to others. What did I have to complain about? So, I get into this place called the Bridge, it's 2 weeks, and kind of common denominator. Some people are there, for alcohol addiction, drug addiction, sex addiction, work addiction. The common denominator is most of us are adult children of alcoholics or dysfunctional families in some way, and dealing with codependency. And the best definition that they gave for codependency was an outer reach for inner security. Outer reach for inner security. I'm not fully healed from that, if you will. It's very present, but just getting conscious of it started to kind of break it down. And a guy who was in there with me, one morning at breakfast, he was saying, you guys, we're not in here because we've been crushing it at life, right? And I was like, oh, damn. Not too far off in a sense. And so it was a sobering time, but I was able to, make that one degree. I think Christine mentioned there's a bunch of physicists, or at least a few in this space. And so, we're just talking about catching the orbit of another planet. So it just was like I was headed down this way, and I just needed a 1 degree trajectory shift to start to kind of come out of my nosedive. That's what happened there. So, coming out or going into it, as my mother-in-law would say, I was lost as an Easter egg. And coming out of it, I started to kind of find my footing. And those 2 weeks, as much as it sounds kind of cliche, were true. They really saved my life and started a big shift. And shifting from codependency to focusing just a little bit more on my capacity and peace, and kind of putting that oxygen mask back on. So, I'll get back a little bit into the backstory. I mentioned my family of origin. And just to be clear, right, like I'm not trying to I can't paint a full picture of my family. I experienced a bunch of support and love and, affection and care from them, but then kind of coming to terms with some of the unhealthy aspects of my family, which is not unique, right? So many of us have shared stories. And I started to actually, I'm gonna pause for just a second. So I got out in the middle of January. And I told you all that was 3 months ago. Well, 3 weeks and a few 3 years and a few weeks ago, I'm photographing an event downtown Nashville for an organization that we sponsored. So I have a production company. We do branded photo and video. I'll tell a little bit more about that. And we're getting some photo and video of this event. Part of the this exchange was, I had a little bit of time up on the stage to talk to this audience. And I had 2 minutes on stage and I say some words that draw a couple people in. I'll repeat what I said. Part of that was, just talked about how I'm crazy about fires. And I've been practicing starting them without a lighter and just using flint and steel. I kind of feel like a kid again. And that week I had lit a fire in my wood burning stove, and a few hours later it died down. I feel like you probably have some stove people in the audience. Right? And it smoked for about 2 minutes. Actually, no, sorry. I put a few pieces of wood on the coals, smoked for 2 minutes, and then brought those coals together and just, right? And then it lit up. It had just enough oxygen. And it came back to fire, and it went from smoke to flame, which is what had just been happening for me in the last month. A friend to this day I met from that conversation, Jeff Thornhill, and Christine was there. And we had both of them kind of afterwards, we had conversations and realized that there was some resonance going on. I was thankful for that night, and I'm still to this day. So, going back to my family origin. So my dad grew up as the son of a member of the Country Music Hall of Fame, Grand Ole Opry. His dad was on the road a lot, right? He was the only boy out of 5 kids. So in a lot of ways had a lonely experience. And really creative with a father who was kind of like in the stars, if you will, for creativity. And my mother, and yet he was kind of like holes in his blue jeans, kind of showing up to church sometimes in camo if he was coming out of the out of the woods, and not really caring a whole lot about what other people think. My mother, on the other side of things, studied fashion in college, grew up with a silver spoon, had more affluent family, and image management was a big deal for her, who we're projecting to be, making sure everybody thinks well of us. That was a fascinating combo of parents to have. I didn't think you would laugh, but I appreciate it. And so my dad is now a recovering alcoholic. He's got 22 years of sobriety, which means that most of my formative years, he was a functioning alcoholic. So I have lots of memories of, trying to wake him up off the couch and kind of getting angry and then going to bed alone. And going to the bars with him and having, like, I've had to this day like 4 bartenders who've seen me since I moved back to Nashville be like, Nathan, how are you doing? So good to see you. Remember, I worked at Pargo and made you milkshakes all the time when you and your dad would come in. And so that was part of my life growing up. My parents divorced when I was 5. My mother remarried, because I'm from Nashville, I didn't say. Moved to Illinois, and I got a brother and a sister out of it. How are we doing on time? When did all right? We're at 10 minutes. Okay. And I got a brother and sister out of it, my dad, I would come back to Nashville every 60 days, and for the summertime. And in a lot of ways, this blessing and a curse, the family that I was leaving here in Middle Tennessee, most especially, some of what my dad was still struggling with, right, wasn't that great. And yet there were so many moments, when my dad was like, because I was his only one, and he was in the outdoors, and he had his father experience who was on the road all the time. He wanted to have a different scenario, right? So I got a little bit of the best of both worlds in some ways. So fast forward, or we're gonna go back to, y'all follow me as I'm kind of ADHD and I go along. Now we're gonna go back to the bridge to recovery, and I'm there 2 weeks, and I look around and we just come out of this, more kind of a charismatic church that was pretty kind of crunchy granola and not into any type of meds of any kind. And I was like, well, you're on some meds, and you're on some meds in this group, and you're on meds, and you're on meds, you're on meds. I was like, well, maybe I could be on meds that would be in the world if I got something to kind of bring my base level of anxiety, bring it down so I can start applying some of these tools. So I got on anxiety meds and started to kind of feel a little bit more buoyant and had stability. Fast forward about 7 months, and I love being on the water. I love floating a kayak, doing anything around a river, an ocean, a lake, or a stream. I went down the Buffalo River with a good friend of mine, and a gentleman who'd been kind of like a mentor and a godfather for a long time. Get down the river, get back to his house. I haven't shared this part publicly too much while we're recording, so here we go. And actually, pretend like I'm not in Buffalo, pretend like I'm in some place out of the country. And we get down the river, and my buddy starts talking about his trip to Peru, and he'd done some ayahuasca. And I had been feeling kind of drawn to experience psilocybin. And so, when I got on the anxiety meds, the intention was to microdose mushrooms on the way out of that and just get on it for a little bit. So I kind of put this energy out there in the universe. Well, that night, my friend was like, hey, do you want to try this? And I was like, I don't know, because I grew up pretty straight edge, right? None of this went very well for my dad in terms of alcohol, weed, and other stuff. And so I was like, but then it felt like a safe setting. And so I had my first experience that night. And it was incredibly cathartic. It was kind of a return back to source, God, goddess, Gaia, whatever you want to call that, the source of consciousness within all of us. And then was able to apply a lot of my therapeutic work. And I was talking to little Nathan, teenage Nathan, adult Nathan, and my inner critic. Let them go float down the river while I hang out with my other, close core IFS members. And that was a really big moment. Fast forward a couple weeks later, my wife had been taking improv classes at Third Coast. So has anybody been to an improv show before? Yes.
Yes.
Has anybody been to Third Coast?
No.
Y'all have. And we went to the bottom of this place called, a tea pack in Nashville. And we get down there and somebody says, all right, we need a word from the audience. They give them a word. And then this group of 6 players, actors, we spent the next 90 minutes to 2 hours and created a whole story from beginning to end in Old English Shakespearean style. And they incorporated and created several songs in that moment. And in the kind of neuroplasticity state still after my experience a couple weeks later, it just blew all my circuits and really started to kind of bring me back to this sense of playfulness. I don't have to have it all together. I don't have to overproduce everything. Maybe progress over perfection really is okay and possible. And it really kind of been awakened. It cleared out like a sad clog or a joy clog, if you will, because I laughed for like 90 minutes. And so that was a really big moment. I want to try to. My time is flying by. If I go a little bit over 20, is anybody have?
It's fine. It's fine. Enjoy.
All right. I'll see most of the game. One person was sleeping back the day just like. So that was October of 23. At the same time, I went to a branding workshop. So, I had been telling people and seeing this trend, like where, people are telling their own story on social, really getting a lot of traction. And I was like, well, you need to do this, and you need to do this. And all my customers and clients were like, you need to do this. But I wasn't doing it. And I was like, all right. So I went to the branding workshop, did a little bit of an exchange where she was like, hey, you can sit in the class and participate. Well, I just self-sabotaged my way through the whole thing. Because what am I doing in this room of, successful entrepreneurs telling their own story? I can't do it. She invited me to a winter workshop in February. I said, all right, I'll check it out. I think I'll think about it. In early January, we had snow in Nashville that was really nice. It wasn't like an ice storm that we just had. We had like 5 to 7 inches. I grew up in Illinois, so I love playing in the snow. Brings me back to being a little kid. I get to be a kid with my kids. I have 3 of them. My dad says, hey, I want y'all to come over to our house and sled down my street. And I was like, it's like 25 minutes away, 20 minutes away. And I was like, yeah, we're just gonna hang out over here. Um, and he was like, no, I just need you, why don't y'all come over here? And I was like, thanks for the offer. We're gonna just kind of stay in our neighborhood. We found a hill that we love. And he thinks the phone is turned off, and I hear him say, selfish. And I was like, Dad, I heard that, I heard, I gotta go. I'll talk to you later. Hung up. And it didn't really start to sit until a couple of days later. And I was like, man, that really kind of pointed at this thing that had been a pain point. And I'd already kind of advocated for my oldest daughter a year or two ago when he called her selfish for not eating, sharing her ice cream with him. And I was like, Dad, you can't do that. Like, it's a kid. Like, stop. And in that moment, I was like, I won't let him do that to my daughter. Why am I letting him do that with me? So we had a hard pause. Dad, if you watch this, we've worked through all of this and thankful for what we've been experienced. So that was a big moment for me standing up as an advocate for myself and starting to stand up for myself. And so I went to that workshop a month later, ripped off the Band-Aid, started sharing my own story. And it was shockingly cathartic and impactful for me in terms of, if I'm going to share my story with you, right, it means I have to silence this curse word inner critic over my shoulder who's constantly talking, being like, you don't have a story to share. Nobody wants to listen to you. You haven't practiced enough. It's not perfect enough. Shut up. You won't be able to talk about something for 10 years or 20, 30 years until you hit whatever level that is. And it really started to make a difference. Around the same season, I also signed up to take kayak lessons to learn how to flip my kayak over when it's upside down, which kind of get goosebumps just talking about because I love being in the water. Always like, oh, that looks cool, want to do it. And so, in a way, right, the moment with my dad was standing up for myself. The moment of recording my story and sharing my story was standing up for myself. And then this whole thing of like learning how to flip a kayak upside down meant that I had to confront that, like, hey, we're not in survival mode anymore. We can do this thing. And that was a more physical experience of, being like, I can do this, building confidence, capacity, and clarity along the way. Um, so I started to pull in people as I was sharing my story. And more importantly, I shifted more towards my why and reconnected with my story along the way. So March 2024, I get this kind of download on like some more clarity around like a vision for my business and what I want to start doing more. And I'll hit on that a little bit. But I started the biggest thing that happened in that moment was I had this kind of this clarity of like, wow, if it had my mother was big on image management, right? She wanted people to look good. She loved asking questions, and she wanted to project this image. And y'all, I have been a photographer for 20 years, and for the last 8 years at that moment, had mostly been taking portraits of people, making them look good, project an image, right? That maybe didn't always match what was happening inside. And ideally feeling a little bit more confident as they walked out and asking a bunch of questions throughout the process. And I was like, that sounds familiar. And then I considered my dad, right, who had been, in a bunch of creative environments, a big dreamer, going back to John Lennon and, had these big visions. Um, and it was a storyteller. He was a writer. His father was a writer, so third generation storyteller. And I was like, kind of makes sense. Maybe, these things that happened to me add up. But then I was like, where does the pain from my past start to make sense? And how do I alchemize that subconsciously? And I started to see that as a photographer, my favorite thing was to take pictures of moments, right? So like she's had a constant smile on her face since I walked in, right? So I would be focusing on y'all reacting because I'm constantly looking as growing up in a dysfunctional family, right? There was a lot of disease and discomfort, and so I was like looking for connection and moments of happiness, looking for connections and moments of happiness, and then capturing that and telling that story along the way. And this from this idea of like, hey, if I can tell your story and your story, maybe that y'all will see that there's not a whole lot of difference and that y'all maybe have some more things in common. And if I had been able to do that with my parents, maybe there wouldn't have been a divorce. Or if I had been able to encourage my mother to share her story and come to terms with like, hey, you don't have to project the image, right? Or my father to be like, hey, you're doing all of these things to numb your pain. What if you just slowed down and looked at what happened in your past? You came to terms with some of your story. So I started to see how all of these things from my past really led to this moment of what I was doing. And it kind of refueled this fire to like, oh, this all makes sense. And I started to feel aligned with what I was doing. So that was kind of leads up to this past year. And I think the biggest, like, why does all this matter to y'all? Right? I mentioned in the beginning that like we're in a world chasing certainty and a season of crazy chaos, right? And um, and capacity matters so much to me now. So what have I been doing to build capacity over the last few years? I've been showing up for myself daily, getting on my yoga mat, getting my hands dirty in the dirt, um, pausing to play, pausing to pursue pleasure, and to be curious about what comes up in terms of desires or interests, and letting myself explore these things that as a kid whose kind of childhood kind of sped up a little bit, maybe those things weren't really afforded to me growing up and building my capacity. Now I still lose my patience and still lose my temper. My wife and my kids can say as much, but it's in a different place than I was 3 years ago. So there's the other thing why this matters now is like there's a pressure to be quiet right now, right? A pressure to play small, to not rock the boat. You don't know what you might say that might get you in trouble, and to not be honest. And has anybody seen this series Severance?
Yes.
Yeah. There's also a little bit of pressure to separate our personal and our professional identities, right? And I don't know about y'all, but that wasn't working so well for me. And so that's a big part of my journey now, right? Is like, hey, how do I integrate these different aspects of myself? And how do I help others kind of refine their story, their personal and professional story, so that when I take your picture, not just like make me feel good in a moment, but ideally, we kind of get into the heart of your story and how that comes out in your brand or as a leader in a business or, a leader in whatever capacity we have so that our personal and our professional gets to be integrated again. And I really feel like that, playing small doesn't really serve my family or my customers or my community. And it doesn't really serve little Nathan. And I believe that our story really paints a picture that the pain and the passion of our past really points to present day, right? Professionally, what are the passions that we can reconnect with and our purpose? And so to close up, I feel like if we can curiously and compassionately look for our story, right? Find our story and then own it, claim it, and embody it, then we get to unlock our voice as we practice telling our story and be visible about it, quieting down that inner critic and building capacity, courage, clarity, and community along the way. Thanks so much for that mission. And thanks for letting me go over time. That's 10 extra minutes.
Oh, thank you.